Good evening, everyone. I think it's time to get underway now. Thank you for joining this month's seminar, Lewis. I'm delighted Joe, one of our younger members, is presenting a summary of his work. We often talk about the construction of roads and their alignment, but this takes a different angle on the subject, employing modern technology. Joe is a second-year PhD student in archaeology at Cambridge, sponsored by the Open Oxford Cambridge AHRC doctoral programme and Cambridge Trust. He is exploring the variability in the routing of Roman roads across Britannia and what this can tell us about how they were used. Published works on the visibility of the Roman road along the Gask Ridge in Scotland, as well as the connection between defended small towns in Roman Britain and the Roman road network. So I'll turn off the introductory slide now and ask Joe to put on his screen share, and then it'll be over to you, Joe. Can you open by perhaps telling us a little more about your background, how you got interested in the Romans and Roman roads, perhaps?
Yeah, hopefully it's coming on now. Hopefully you can see my screen. It's just loading. Can you see my screen now? Okay. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, no. So I probably got into kind of archaeology and Romans quite similar to a lot of people. It was time team. So that was the big kind of draw to archaeology. But then, so my granddad was a keen kind of archaeologist and geologist, and kind of he really liked being in the field. So when I was younger, I would kind of go out with him and just traipse around and think about all these kind of historical cool things. So I actually did geology as an undergraduate degree. So I did geology, and then I decided that the oil and gas industry wasn't really for me. So then I went to do my master's, and that was when I really started exploring archaeology again. And hopefully throughout this presentation you'll kind of get a gist of it, but I'm quite into using kind of digital techniques to understand archaeology and kind of bring the two together. So during my master's, I tried to kind of bridge that gap between GIS, so geographical information science, and archaeology. And my master's was on Roman roads in Britain, and that was largely driven by the fact that we have these methods that people apply, but I was looking into, are these the right methods? Do we need potentially new methods to investigate Roman roads through computational methods? And from my master's, I kind of concluded that yes, we need better methods, and that's the main driver of my PhD. So it's about developing new methods to kind of develop our understanding of roads, Roman in particular, because we have a vast kind of quantity of data on Roman roads, but kind of movement more generally. So one of the things I do want to do, for example, is have a look how different empires across the world compare to one another. So, for example, the Inca Empire had a very large road system as well. How does that compare to the kind of roads in the Roman Empire? How does that compare to other empires? But that's kind of outside of scope of this presentation. So this is a lot more local. So this is public roads in Roman Britain. So without further ado, unless you have another question, Dave, I'll start the presentation. So firstly, thank you to the association for the opportunity to present my PhD research, and for everyone attending. this is so as Dave said, I'm into my second year. So the results I am going to show are quite early, but they're quite tentative and they may change, but hopefully it gives a gist of my research, the methods I use, and what I'm trying to understand by modeling roads in Roman Britain. So I thought it'd be good to start by taking an empire-wide perspective. So the Roman Empire at its peak, AD 98 to 117, spanned roughly 5 million square kilometers and included 7 different climatic zones and a multitude of local landscapes. From the temperate northwestern provinces, such as Britain and France, characterized by seasonality and high levels of precipitation, the arid summers and wet winters of the Mediterranean, to the deserts of Egypt. The expansion, consolidation, and functioning of this very large empire was only possible through the establishment of a well-maintained road system, and it's roughly 300,000 kilometers of roads. About 90,000 of these are paved. And by constructing these roads, the military had stable access to areas across the empire, the transmission of information was made easier, large-scale economic integration was possible, religion spread, and mobility reached unprecedented levels. So they're quite important for Rome in general. Despite this, though, variability in the roads across the Roman Empire has often been overlooked. And I think this is predominantly due to the massive task of collating information on roads, even within a single province. And Britain is really good for this, but it's still quite difficult, let alone for doing that for the whole of the empire. However, I argue that by looking at variability, we can start to explore questions such as, were there general guidelines that Roman engineers followed when constructing roads? Can we identify similarities and differences in roads across the empire? Are we able to infer the road's motive or importance based on its characteristics? Are roads driven by just environmental considerations, or do other factors play a role? And these are the kind of questions that really kind of, once you understand its variability, then you can start questioning. When looking at the characteristics of Roman roads, 4 particulars are common. The first is to focus on the construction material used to build a road. The second is how wide the roads are. The third, the legal status that the road possessed. And finally, what route did the road take between its origin and destination? For information on the first 3 characteristics, so construction material, width of roads, and legal definitions, I recommend Mike's presentation last month on how to identify a Roman road. Thankfully, however, my research focuses on the 4th characteristic, the route of a road. So what do I actually mean by the route of a road? The route of a road? Essentially, it's the route taken within the landscape to connect the road's origin and destination. And by exploring where and how the roads traverse the landscape, we can start to unravel the social, economic, and political system in which they were constructed. We can ask, why did a road take a certain route? What factors influence the route of a road? What was the function of a road? And this is reflected in its route. And there's a really nice diagram of this, which I've got here by David French. He unfortunately passed away before he was able to kind of develop it fully. But in his Roman road system of Asia Minor, he builds up a kind of holistic picture of all of the different things that impact road networks. And as I said, by looking at road networks, we can kind of untangle the story to then work our way back from the road network to all of these different requirements that are taken into account when the road is created. So now that we've discussed the different ways in which variability of Roman roads can be explored, and that we'll focus on the route of roads, it's worth turning to what impacts this. Hugh Davies, in his book Roads in Roman Britain, which if you haven't read, I definitely recommend, notes 3 factors. The first is engineering, the second topography, and the third traffic. Whilst it's useful to look at Roman surveyors and how they overcame difficulties when deciding where to build roads, for example, through the construction of tunnels and bridges, this won't be covered within this presentation. This choice is predominantly driven by the fact that overcoming difficulties are just the tools used to accomplish a certain task. So creating the road to take a certain route. And what we want to understand is a motive behind the task. So why did they choose a particular route? And due to this, we'll be focusing on the first two, or the second two, sorry. So topography and traffic. When constructing the road from its origin to its destination, the topography determines whether there are features that need to be avoided or dealt with. For example, it's common that Roman roads across the empire avoid valleys due to their increased risk of flooding. However, it's important to note that environmental factors do not always dictate the route of roads. In the case of the Via Appia in Italy, so they're the queen of the roads, for example, the road was built across the malaria-infested Pontine marshlands. So from Rome, to southeast going down. Whilst it would be insensible, or seem sensible to avoid this malaria-infested area, the route for Via Appia reflects instead the military and political importance of a road for controlling Rome's nearby neighbours. So rather than being dictated by the topography and what they had to overcome, the military and political importance took precedence. The route of the roads are also affected by the expected traffic due to their need to provide a passable route for whatever traffic they are designed to carry. A road constructed for those on foot, horseback, or pack animals can be steeper than those designed for wheeled vehicles. By looking at the maximum gradients of the route of the roads, we can start to understand how well adapted a particular road is for wheeled vehicles, and potentially suggest the road's original intended function. For example, the image shown here is of a Roman road in Cyprus with a slope of 15 degrees, and I've highlighted it in yellow, so it's quite hard to see, but it's this kind of road here. And although 15 degrees is feasible for pack animals, vehicles would have struggled. Therefore, we can infer that this road was likely not constructed to carry vehicles. And this is just an example of moving from what we see in kind of archaeological record, so where the road is, its maximum gradient and so on, and then developing an idea of the logistics that it took into account and how that's reflected and how it was used during its time. So I've explored why roads are important, what variability we can explore, and what impacts the routes of the roads. So maybe you're wondering, where does modelling come into this? Before discussing in detail, I thought it'd be worth to explore modelling the roads more generally. So there are two main approaches when modelling roads. The predictive on the left, which involves using a model to predict an unknown route between a known origin and destination. And the post-predictive, which is where we know where the road is, and we want to explore what factors might have influenced the route of the road. The basis of both approaches can be based on general assumptions about humans move through the landscape, such as the need for minimizing energy expenditure, minimizing the cost of building a road, the amount of time it takes, or any other factor like that, or through the incorporation of context-specific information, such as a preference for high ground. As the route of many Roman roads are known, the post-predictive approach when exploring Roman roads is common. This is in contrast to the predictive approach, which is more commonly used when understanding potential movement where physical traces are lacking. So kind of prehistoric to pre-Rome, and it is quite common to have the predictive, whereas the post-predictive is more likely to be used in kind of Roman and then moving kind of closer to today, because we have the traces, so we can actually do post-predictive modeling. And since we're exploring known Roman roads in our case, our focus will be limited to the post-predictive modeling. So where we know where the road is, and we want to try to understand why it took that route through modeling. So how do we actually post-predict roads? We'll first show this through a conceptual example, and then we'll explore the method in detail. If you first imagine that we know the route of a Roman road, and this isn't a real Roman road, this is just a hypothetical one, and it's shown in the left image. We then want to start to understand what might have impacted its route. That is, why is it where it is? We can speculate potential factors such as the need for the road to be below a certain gradient due to it being used by vehicles, that the road was constructed to minimize the time taken to travel between the origin and destination, or even that there was a focus on limiting the altitude of the road. By creating models that incorporate these factors and quantifying how advantageous or disadvantageous these factors are, we can create simulations of these roads as shown in the images on the right. The first of the two images on the right show a simulated road where the only factor is a minimization of time. So from your origin and destination, it maximizes the speed at which you can travel. Whilst the second includes the minimization of time, but then as well also includes the altitude has to be below 140 meters. And if a simulated route shares a simulated road, shares a similar route to the known road, this could suggest that those factors incorporated within the model reflects the factors that influence the route of the known road. So for example, here we can see that minimizing time is quite similar to our known route on the left, but there's a slight deviation here. Whereas in this case, if we include altitude below 140 meters, we can then see that the simulated route is exactly the same. And by replicating this process for all roads of interest, we can start to understand collectively, are there similarities and differences in what Roman engineers considered when constructing roads? Are there rules or guidelines? Rules or guidelines for these considerations? What were the logistical requirements of the roads, for example, being suitable for vehicles? Are there patterns in the variability in the route of roads? Is this just a matter of terrain, or do other factors play a role? But before discussing some of these questions, let's first turn to seeing how the method actually works in practice. So in this example, I have a grid representation on the left that shows how long it takes to move through each grid square. This is essentially my model that will be used when calculating the route. Blue being a lower time, so quicker to move through, and yellow being a higher time, so slower to move through. Whilst I've used time here, the grid and its values can represent anything. Common examples include elevation, land cover type, distance to nearest river, and so on. From our grid representation, we want to calculate the route between a specified origin and destination with the lowest cumulative cost. For us, based on our grid representation, that will be the path where time to move between the origin and destination is minimized. This is done through a method called least cost path analysis. And least cost path analysis works by first iteratively accumulating the cost values from the origin to all other locations within the grid. This is shown in the right image. So you can see here from the accumulated costs, for at your origin, it's 0. Whereas let's say you move north, that's an accumulated cost of 5, and then 28. And so for example, 5, 24 is a rounding error here, but it's essentially you're just accumulating as you go from your origin point. And using this cumulative grid, the path with the least accumulated cost is then calculated by working backwards from the destination to the origin. And this is what the path looks like, shown in red. If we work from the destination B towards the origin A, we can see that the calculated path first goes south towards the lowest neighboring grid cell of 86, and then on to 76, and then 69, continuing the process until we finally reach the origin A. And this is our simulated route based on our model of minimizing time. So for example, here we have 105, 102, 86 here is the lowest value in the neighboring cells, and then 76, 69, 57, and so on. So let's take this idea further. Let's say we incorporate some barrier that stops the road from taking a particular path. We'll assume that the barrier is a mountain, but it could be something else like a river or a swamp or anything that inhibits movement within a particular area within our grid. Due to this barrier, the cumulative grid from the same origin as before will look different. this will subsequently have an impact on the calculated path. So we can see here from our left and right, they have the same origin, but the cumulative values are different. And this is because we have this barrier in the middle. And here we can see how this plays out. Rather than the original path taking a route through the center of the grid, the path is forced to go around the barrier and thus changing its route. We can see, for example, that the path in the right image goes north from the destination, making its way west and then south to the origin. This makes sense as the inclusion of a barrier makes going south more costly than moving northwards from the destination. So for example, from here, rather than going south, which costs 112, so it'd be an increase. We obviously want to decrease our cumulative cost. So we go north to 95, 93, 86, and so on. And hopefully these examples illustrate conceptually and methodologically the process of post-dicting known roads, how the method works more generally, as well as showing its general flexibility of using least cost path analysis to post-dict known roads. And feel free to ask any questions on this at the end of the presentation. Now that we've seen the general background, the method, let's get into the actual case study, modeling public roads in Roman Britain. To post-dictively model the Roman roads in Britain, there are two bits of information we need. First, the route of the roads, and the second, the origin and destination of these roads. For the route of the roads, I have predominantly used the roads traced by Ivan Margary and reported in his book, Roman Roads in Britain. These roads have been digitized by Mike Bishop and are freely available on his website. I've added a link at the bottom here in case you'd like to look. To make the project feasible, however, I've limited the routes to those appearing in the Antonine itinerary. The Antonine itinerary is a collection of a written list of places and their distances along public roads across all regions of the Roman Empire. Dated from the late quarter of the 3rd century AD, it is thought that the Antonine itinerary was compiled from a series of smaller itineraries of different lengths and styles. Multiple sources for the Antonine itinerary have been proposed, ranging from the official records used during imperial or military travel to the collation of publicly displayed route lists by travellers. All routes appearing in the Antonine itinerary are public routes. That is, routes constructed and maintained at the expense of the Roman state. So they're also known as VI Publicae. And I've included an example of the Antonine itinerary for Roman Britain. So for example, here we can see from my, translation of the Roman sites to where they are in modern day. We can see, for example, from Binchester to Catterick is around 19 miles apart, with Catterick to Aldborough being around 22. And if you another link here, so this is for the association's website, and they have a great description on the Antonine itinerary, as well as the different itis of routes as well. So definitely check that out if you're interested for more. So using the Roman roads from Ivan Margary, which are in red, and the Antonine itinerary, we can create this map. The origins and destinations noted in the Antonine itinerary are highlighted by orange points, with the routes shown in white. The keen eyes amongst you might notice that there are two orange points in the eastern Cambridgeshire area with no white routes. So just here. This is due to the ambiguity in the modern day equivalence of the locations reported in the Antonine itinerary. In these cases, I've erred on the side of caution and excluded them from the analysis. As I've only just finished the first year of my PhD, we'll focus on the southern section of Roman Britain as highlighted. So let's zoom in and kind of take a more detailed look at southern Britain. So notable routes within the southern section include the routes from Richborough to Canterbury and then on to London. So here, Richborough to Canterbury and then on to London, which Margary describes as one of the most important roads in Britain. This road from Richborough to Canterbury would have been built shortly after the conquest, with Richborough acting as a principal point of entry from Roman Gaul, France. To show the use of post-dictive modelling for understanding known routes, so rather than giving another hypothetical example, we'll actually see it in practice, we'll briefly explore the Roman road from Canterbury to Dover, highlighted in yellow. So this southwest or northwest road here. So using Margary Roman Road 1A from Canterbury to Dover as an example, we'll see what factors have been included within my preliminary model and what the current results tell us about the road. With the origin and destination of Canterbury and Dover, I've calculated hypothetical routes based on potential factors that might have influenced the route of the Roman road. For this, I've only included a maximum possible gradient and the road that was that the road was constructed to minimize the time taken to travel between Canterbury and Dover. The second image here shows the results of all of these hypothetical routes using different values for the maximum possible gradient. I've colored the routes based on the distance from the known Roman road, with purple denoting the routes furthest away. From this, we can see that some of the hypothetical routes are closer to the Roman road than others. In the third image, we've taken the results from the second image and filtered the routes to those within 500 meters from the known Roman road. When looking at the values of the maximum gradient of these routes, the values are around 4 degrees. That is, the maximum gradient needed to produce hypothetical routes similar to the known Roman road is around 4 degrees. Although it's not suggested that Roman engineers worked on the basis of a maximum gradient when constructing their Roman roads, the maximum gradient values can be used to indicate the potential motive behind the road. In the case of Margary Roman Road 1A, it has previously been suggested to have been used by those with non-military roles with wheeled vehicles carrying goods from Roman Gaul, France to London. The maximum gradient of 4 degrees adds further evidence that this road was suitable for wheeled vehicles used by non-military personnel who didn't have the kind of impetus to be able to push up those steeper gradients. So moving from a specific example to the overall picture, we can see there's quite a bit of variability in the maximum gradient across Roman roads in southern Britain, with yellow being lower gradients and purple being higher gradients. Although these results are tentative, it does suggest, for example, that the Roman roads from Dover towards London, so which is part of Watling Street, were constructed to have a gradient that was more amenable to wheeled vehicles. However, further research is needed to assess whether this is largely due to the easier topography within the southeast of Britain, or whether we can attribute these decisions to their intended motive. Although the model incorporated maximum gradient and the minimization of time was able to post-dict many of the Roman roads, not all Roman roads were modeled adequately, and these are shown in white. So there's 4 different roads here currently. This suggests that the current model of just minimization of time and maximum gradient does not incorporate all of the factors that influence the route of these Roman roads, and indicates that further work is needed to develop a better model that allows us to better understand those particular routes. Having briefly discussed my results so far for the southern Britain, what are the next steps for my research? So for the rest of my PhD, I'll be working on modelling the rest of the public Roman roads within the British section of the Antonine itinerary. Whilst doing this, I'll also be looking at other potential factors that can be incorporated within the model. Examples based on previous research include a preference for Roman roads being built along ridgeways, the general avoidance of valleys, and the importance of being near river systems. Once the models have been created and I can post-dict the known Roman roads sufficiently well, I then intend to explore potential causes for this variability, so the variability in the route of Roman roads. Is this correlated with terrain, with more difficult terrain seeing higher gradients, for example? Or for example, do the pre-Roman settlements have an influence on the route of the Roman roads? So this is going back to that David French diagram, bring in what we've understand from post-predicting the known roads to then understand their motive and what potentially drove those decisions, be that from a kind of terrain perspective or social, economic, political factors that might have influenced the route. Depending on the time available within the PhD, I also aim to assess whether the models developed when modelling Roman roads in Britain are directly applicable to other provinces. And if not, why not? Do Roman roads in other provinces follow different preferences, for example? And moving beyond the PhD, I'd also really like to explore how well the models developed when trying to post-predict known Roman roads can be used to identify potential routes of unknown Roman roads. So that's going from what we know and we're able to model them to then be able to understand what we don't know. And with that, my presentation's over. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions you may have, and feel free to reach out through email or on Twitter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I've got a few questions already. I decided not to interrupt your flow. You seem to be going very well there. That's been very interesting. I'm going to start off with a couple of my own. One of the powers that being the MT gives you is that you can jump the queue a little bit. So I'm going to start off with one or two of my own, Joe, if I may. And following the sort of BBC example, one question's actually got two in it. How does the model deal with crossing steep-sided valleys? If it's avoiding steep slopes, the steep side of a valley might look like it's very difficult obstacle. And similarly, if a model rejects the unacceptable gradients, can it factor in that a zigzag could climb the slope rather than making a detour around a more diverse route?
Yeah, so the first one, so this is one of the great things about creating models, and also potentially the negative, is that we're not trying to replicate exactly the kind of real life, because that's extremely complicated. So in this example here for Canterbury to Dover, what I do is I filter to within 500 meters, and it's quite subjective in the sense of how far does it have to be from the known road to say it's good enough. But in the case, for example, of the steep kind of escarpments and so on, they're quite difficult because they're extremely local. And by creating models, we're at least from my perspective, and what I'm trying to do is kind of go away from the micro detail to the kind of bigger picture. But it's definitely something you can incorporate, and kind of if there's a particular road that's interesting, you really kind of drill down into that road and really understand the nuance within that. And then the second question, sorry, was on the...
It's whether a really steep incline, or whether the model can accommodate a zigzag. Yes.
So, but in this case, how I've done it, so essentially what it says is that, let's say I have a maximum gradient of 12 degrees. That means that all gradients above 12 degrees, you can't travel. But there are potential other ways where you can, rather than saying above a maximum gradient, it's impossible, you can make higher gradients more difficult to travel. And that's when you create those zigzags. So there are different ways that you can go from so if I just go back to this here, so obviously this one is based on time, but you can do on other factors. So for example, you can say that if there's a particular slope and it's above a certain threshold, we will make it a lot more difficult to travel, but it's still possible to travel. And that's when you get those zigzags. So it's extremely flexible in what you can do. It's just creating models to kind of replicate what you have in your head.
Okay, thanks for that, Joe. I'm glad you've got the grid up as the screen share at the moment, because we have a question about that. It was just asking what the reminder of the left-hand grid is actually showing.
Yeah, so this is it's no data in particular, so it's just random values. But in the kind of concept, so it's just how long it takes to travel through a particular grid square. And so if you imagine, for example, this, let's say it's in minutes. So this cell takes five minutes. This one takes 24 minutes. And you could potentially infer from that, if you want to do that, this 5 took less time because it was flatter, whereas this grid took more time because it was steeper and more difficult. But it's just a kind of a conceptual way to understand how we go from this gridded representation to creating a route. Hopefully that answered your question. But in the case, I probably should have mentioned, but in the case of the actual modeling of the roads, so this is based on the Ordnance Survey digital elevation model, so the 50 meters elevation model. So this one takes into account the elevation and the difference between all of the cells to then be able to calculate how long it takes for you to travel.
You've mentioned a few times about the sort of training and standards of the engineers and surveyors.
Yes.
Have you been able to infer what might have been in their guidebook of how they did things, their training perhaps?
So this is one thing I do want to explore, because there was a book. So it was about Italian roads, and they were just saying about the fact that there does not hard and fast rules, but more guidelines, in the sense there are guidelines that you would follow. So for example, if you can keep it within a certain gradient, you would probably do that. But they're extremely flexible. And I think if you go back to Mike's presentation last month, when you look at the construction, it's very much dependent on what's available and probably how much time and effort they want to put into it. But I definitely do think, at least when you look from an import-wide perspective, there are commonalities that come out. So for example, that if they can use a ridgeway, they will. And some people have said it's because it's easier for you to be able to see potential enemies and so on, and kind of for protection. And then there's also some suggestions that they use certain slope faces, and that's because the erosion is less on that. I can't remember what slope face it is, but the erosion is less on that slope face. So there's definitely preferences, but I think they're quite flexible in how they approach the certain obstacles. And then just one last point as well, is at least from my understanding, there's no, it very much seemed to be, and I think in Hadrian's Wall you see examples of this, where there are particular teams who are working on a particular road at a particular time, and then a different team will be working on another location. So it's probably quite flexible in who's actually doing the work.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. We've got something from Robert Hageman in Holland. So thanks. Good to see you on the line there, Robert. I think it's a bit of a statement, really. Keeping account of altitudes in modelling, this factor must be treated relative to relief and inundations, not in terms of absolute heights. So I don't know whether that's helpful to you, Joe.
Yes. So the altitude was more of a just kind of something to throw into this into this model, but it's definitely something to take into account. That an altitude, as you said, depends on where you're looking. So, for example, in the Alps, it's very different than in Rome, in Britain. But definitely, and thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. From Lewis White, we have it would be helpful to have the gradient in 1 to 10, 1 to 100, for example, as it is the way a surveyor would work out the route. And he's saying the wheelchair route now is 1 in 12, for example.
Yeah. Sorry for that. So I've got it here actually. So so in for example, but 1 in 5. So that's So I will keep that in mind, and thank you for pointing out, because that's it's definitely useful.
Thank you. Martin Packer is asking, could this statistical approach predict where, for example, mancios are likely to be on known roads?
Yes, yeah. So there's and I've got it. No, I don't. So there is a Stanford project that does similar things to this, where they calculate how long, for example, it takes to travel a known road. But one of the things they don't do is incorporate slope or the gradient, and obviously moving up a steep gradient takes longer than flat land. So there's definitely a way to be able to kind of go from this and the gradients and time and so on to understand how long it would take a certain route, how long it would take, and then, as you said, then be able to predict where your mantle areas are, which will be roughly spaced kind of every 30 meters or so, I believe.
Yeah.
Or 30 kilometers.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. And following up from that, also from Martin, is on following up from predicting where these service stations are, whether this modelling could give insight into long-term viability of excess pit stops.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, actually. So I've read and no one's actually tested it, so it's quite it's a kind of an empirical observation. But in I think Lionel Casson's book, he notes that in more difficult terrain, you'll have your pit stops closer together. So it would be really interesting to see if you can identify areas where they have more pit stops than you'd expect, or potentially that I was going to say that they would need, but they obviously create them because of a need. So that's potentially one way you could investigate whether routes that are important, is that reflected in the amount of pit stops they have, because obviously that's where the kind of military or the administration would go and kind of pick up new kind of carts and get their kind of horses looked at and so on. So it's definitely a really interesting question and something to look into. Thank you, Martin.
And from Mark Willingale, we have excellent research, which I think we'll all endorse on that. From Mark's research, the roads complement the river transport system that preceded them. So analysing the preferred links between the rivers should result in positive feedback from the least cost path analysis.
Yeah, definitely. So I know I've so in the paper that Dave Armstrong mentioned at the beginning, so looking at defending small towns and the road network, I make this point as well. But it's very easy to forget that the rivers were important, if not more important, or at least in some areas in for the military, for example, than the roads. The issue with that is, unfortunately, we don't have that much information on which rivers were used. So there is a medieval kind of data set that does record rivers that have been mentioned or kind of inferred from sources. But definitely, there's definitely a lot of work, I think, that can take the road network, the river network, and really understand them together. And I would love to explore that. And I think, thank you, Mark, because that's definitely something I do want to investigate more, because I do feel it's been overlooked.
Okay, thanks. And from Paul Baker, we have, did you have an algorithm relating speed of travel as a function of gradient and the distance the up or down lasted for? If so, how accurate would that be, as also it relies on type of traffic?
Yeah, so I say refrain from saying, but it's so this is one thing I'm exploring quite a lot within the research more generally. So how I've minimized time in this case is through a Tobliss hiking function. So that's just taking your how fast you can go based on your slope. So that's based on as I guess as the name suggests, people hiking. There are other algorithms that people have developed based on wheeled vehicles or wheeled vehicles, as well as looking at other kind of groups of people, so kind of the military and so on. But it's quite difficult to create one, partly because it would require you doing some kind of modern day experiments to create cost functions that are applicable to the types of traffic. And it's definitely something that needs a lot more work into it. And I'd love to do it. So I know there's a few places where people have tried to do it for llamas and so on. So it would definitely be fascinating to look into it more. And I know that I won't say his first, and I'm going to butcher his name, but Rapestat, and I'll put his name in the chat. He writes a lot about traffic and pack animals, and he's very much focused on kind of creating experiments to be able to answer that. But in short, Paul, and thank you for the great question. More work needs to be done.
Okay, thanks, Joe. From Delwyn Matthews, in his book, The Secret History of the Roman Roads of Britain, Mike Bishop thinks that the roads did not give us the new road network. They merely adapted an existing one, i.e. used or followed ancient trackways, etc. This implies that they quickly used what was there to some extent, beat their quick military needs first. Do you have any thoughts or comments on this? It implies there were sometimes other factors involved.
Yeah, definitely, and I completely agree. So in the case here, for example, Margary Roman Road 1A. So this Roman road here that goes and follows a ridge, this is thought to be the road that the kind of wheeled vehicles would use. And there are some other traces roughly around here where it doesn't follow the ridgeway, and they think these were the pre-Roman trackways that were used for kind of people, pre-Roman kind of not non-wheeled vehicles. So there are definitely other factors involved, and one of the things I do want to explore is how the pre-Roman settlements then influenced where the roads went, so the route of the roads, because I definitely feel that it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, and I think Mike said it in his presentation, that the Romans came and they disregarded everything that was there before and kind of said, this is what we're going to do, and they do it. So there's definitely, it's going to be kind of a phrase I'm going to use continuously, but there definitely needs to be a lot more work in looking at trackways, relating those to the Roman roads, and then understanding how they interact.
Okay, thanks, Joe. We've a couple more questions from Lewis White.
Yeah.
On short, steep section, e.g. to get up the scarp slope of the Downs, more than one horse could be used, as with stagecoaches on the 18th century Brighton Road at Reigate Hill. And also he's making the point that the importance of fresh water for horses and people. Watling Street goes from spring to spring, and the Fossway in Gloucestershire. Stane Street makes a beeline from London to Ewell in what is now southwest London and Surrey, pre-existing Celtic spring settlement. And he also makes the point that fresh air and perhaps fewer trees on hills, so less risk of ambush, and where there's more trees and more humid in the valleys, and plus the soils are wetter. I think you've mentioned that a little bit already, Joe.
Yeah, and this is really important. Yeah, so I think it's easy to forget that they did have to, as you said, they had to focus on the horses and the people and so on. And I know at least in kind of what you said from the springs and the springs. So there's quite a few, particularly in the southeast. I think it's Springhead and a few other places where they do have a pre-Roman and then Roman kind of religious significance. And on the first point, so on the horses, definitely. So for one, in going back to the Margary Roman Road 1A, one of the reasons why they do think that, or at least suggest that this road took the ridge, it kind of on top of the reasons you mentioned as well about trees and so on, is that it was built for non-military personnel. So they won't necessarily have multiple horses to kind of animals, because mules and so on, to kind of push it up these steep gradients. But there's definitely a lot of things you need to take into account. And yeah, it's definitely a lot of work for me to do over the next 2 years. And thank you, Lewis.
Thanks, Joe. From Martin Shan, who echoes about the very interesting talk. Thank you. And he's querying, what is the typical grid cell size that you're using, and does it vary depending on the terrain?
Yeah, so this is again one of the difficulties with the approaches, in the sense that you can choose an extremely small grid cell size. So LiDAR, for example, let's say at 2 meters. But the issue is when you're dealing with a quite big area, there's a lot of data that you have to deal with. And this method is quite takes a lot of computational power. It's quite a burden in that regard. So in this case, I did use the OS, so the Ordnance Survey 50-meter DEM, but they do have a 5-meter DEM that I plan to use. And I do, my general suggestion for this, when you look, is to think about what you're trying to model, in the sense, in the Roman roads, you have your aga, which is six meters or so, but then the general width of the space that they were normally looking at was probably potentially 40 meters, or 40 feet, sorry, about 40 feet. So then that might suggest that 50 meters is fine. But it is difficult. And as you said, it does vary depending on the terrain, because obviously if you're concerned about a road that goes between this small, but between kind of a tunnel that is 5 meters, let's say, if I use a DEM, so a digital elevation model of 50 meters, that wouldn't capture that 5 meters. So it is difficult. There's multiple trade-offs, unfortunately.
We have another question from Lewis White.
Yeah.
He's asking whether a Roman military or civil engineer handbook has ever been discovered for road and fort construction. And I think we got the answer for that last month, or a previous month, from Mike, that we have nothing. We have Vitruvius with his engineering handbook, but it doesn't relate directly to roads.
Yeah, and yeah, so this is one of the I say issues, but is in we have to kind of retrace, and this is where I think post-predictive modeling really helps. That we know where the roads are. Can we then work backwards to then create, let's say, our modern interpretation with nuance and ambiguity potentially of a Roman military or guidebook, let's say. It sounds like a book title, but
yeah, and from Nick Savage, and I think this relates to the sort of grid size that we were talking about a few minutes ago. How well parallelized are your codes, and would access to high performance computing help you?
Yeah. So it's so how it works is for each time, for example, I pick a maximum traversable gradient, I calculate my route, and then I replicate the process. And I can spread that between multiple computers, so that's not too bad. And definitely, if I did have a high performance computing, it would it would help. I do have access to the university's one, and I'm trying to get access to the main university one. But unfortunately, archaeology doesn't take precedence over things like genetics and physics. Unfortunately, so.
Sadly, so, yeah. And that probably links to my question that I was going to have at the end, which from your answer there, it suggests that we can't run this model on our little laptops on our tables.
No, you can. So you can. There will be some trade-offs you have to make. So, for example, you might have to use a digital elevation model of 200 meters or 50 meters or something like that. There are unfortunately multiple trade-offs that you do have to make. There's also another trade-off that, and I'll go back to here so you'll be able to see. So in this example here, I've created a neighbor of 4 directions. So that's why the simulated road here is quite jagged. But in real life, we obviously don't walk in kind of 4 directions. We can walk in 360. So there's you can essentially allow for for more neighbors that kind of is more in line with what we do in real life, but that does have a burden. But it's definitely something you can run, and I can. Yeah, so if you have access, for example, to QGIS or ArcGIS, they have this functionality. So it's definitely something you can run. You just might have to make some trade-offs, so you're not waiting a long time, or your computer kind of turns off from overheating.
Because my question is really that many of us are tracing the routes of Roman roads, and we're probably all sitting wondering how we can link together gap in our roads, and whether your model could help us in this.
Yeah, so this is one bit I'm quite interested in, actually, is that let's say I'm able to model a section here and then model a section here, and there's a middle bit where we don't know if kind of just by a good inference they probably decided on a similar rule or kind of guideline, but if for that middle section. So there's definitely work that can be done there. And one of the things I do want to do, and I'm quite keen in opening up data and so on for people to use and play around with. So my intention is to make what I get from my results kind of publicly accessible. So there's definitely things people can play around with and so on. So hopefully it might be useful in that regard.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And the questions are coming, they're still coming. We haven't had our David Brea question yet either. I know he's online. And from Alan Moore, and going back to the grids again, can you include multiple variables in a grid cell and weight them accordingly?
Yes, yeah. So I'm just trying to find an example that might show it. Okay, yeah, but yeah, no, the answer is yes. So if you imagine we had 4 different variables and we said, and this is actually done for example, if you work on a nature park and you're trying to create a route. So you say, we have these 2 points, we want to connect the 2 routes. For example, we want to minimize the impact to a certain type of plant or things like that. You can create multiple variables so each factor, and then you weight them based on your preference, for example, for how much weight they should have. And yeah, that is a long answer, but yes.
And presumably that's where the post-predictive message starts honing those variables,
Yes,
to what the Romans actually deployed.
Yes, yeah, completely. And I did, and sorry if I did whistle kind of stop tour past it, but that's completely it. So it's about you piecing together that we know where the known Roman roads are. We know where they are. We're trying to kind of make a judgment of what we think a Roman surveyor or engineer or whatever took into account when they decided where to build it. So we're kind of trying to get into I say the heads of what they decided to do, and that's completely it.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And then from Paul Baker, we have, how would the Romans have had the data of sufficient accuracy to choose routes on which your modelling is based, i.e. principally elevation and gradient? And
Yeah.
I don't know whether that just relates to the training of the surveyor.
I think it's a part of the training of surveyor, but then also in regards to the model, at least, I've tried to kind of get away from saying this is exactly what they thought, because even when we record a known road, we decide, for example, to take readings every meter or however kind of incremental. So that has a bias already. And by having this filter within a certain buffer, so this 500 meters, for example, we're not trying to get an exact answer, but an approximation that, so in the case here, the maximum gradient is around 4 degrees, but it does vary. So there, you might be able to see, but there are multiple routes that are within the 500 meters. that have certain or different maximum gradients, but it's around 4 degrees. So it's not, and then another bit that I do want to focus on a lot is that there's going to be some random component to it, in that a surveyor, and however good they are, they will make a certain decision at that time without having perfect knowledge. So they will make a judgment at that time. So if we incorporate that kind of randomness, or that kind of stochastic nature of humanness into the model, that makes it more kind of realistic. But it's definitely something that's good, and I think it's always good to, and I think this is where postdictive works really well, is trying to go, yes, you can create a model, and this is one of the things that's really good about having these conversations, is that you create models, and then you can judge, does it make sense? Are we missing something, or are we pushing something onto the Romans, for example, that they didn't even think about?
Okay, thanks, Joe. And another question from Mark Willingdale, and I think I'll expand it slightly, if I may.
Yeah.
There tends to be two types of Roman road routes: those that adapted and improved earlier roads, with Dover to Canterbury as an example, as you've used, and others that are more rigorous sets of straight limbs, such as Dover, Richborough. I would also add the difference between the roads built across a very flat terrain and the roads built across a very hilly area as well tend to be very different.
Yeah.
And it would be, and Mark goes on to say, it would be good to focus on the more rigorous roads, as they will best express the Roman road algorithms.
Yeah, so I didn't show it here, but from my first kind of year pilot study that I had to do, my model wasn't able to, so one single model wasn't able to predict, kind of post-dict, understand all of the known roads. There were multiple models that I had to use to be able to understand particular roads. And as Dave said, and you said, that there might be different kind of types or tendencies depending on where you are, or who's building, or kind of whether it's military focused or whether it's kind of at a later date. But definitely, I definitely think that the more kind of rigorous roads are, let's say, I say easier, but then there's probably less components or kind of factors that have to be taken into account. So, for example, and I haven't shown it here, but so for example, this Canterbury to Richborough. So this is based on what Ivor Margery recorded, and there's been a debate about 20 years ago, to be honest, but a debate about whether this is a late Roman road or even a medieval road, and whether a straight road from Richborough to Canterbury was built, and then it later fell out of use because it became flooded. And that's part, and this is a slight detour, but I think quite interesting, is that they think it was potentially a straighter, kind of more impressive road, largely due to the fact you had kind of Claudius, the Roman emperor, coming in, and he probably doesn't want to have this not that nice Roman road. He wants to obviously have his kind of empowerment of kind of power and kind of prestige, and a straight road would do that. But no, definitely there definitely seems to be types or kind of categories, and not just one set of Roman road. This is how you do it.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And still the questions keep coming. Further one from Robert Hageman. In post-dictive analysis, the outcome should be what weights the Romans themselves attributed to the relevant variables. Still, we don't know all the variables they use. Is that right?
Yeah. So I haven't shown it here, but one of the things that I do need to look into more is that, yes, we can include other variables. So, for example, let's say we take that they don't want to go through a valley if they don't need to. How do we weight that kind of? And that's one of the questions, is in, we want to understand, if it wasn't there, it will obviously they would need to take into account. How much weighting does that have to be? So how important does that have to be as a disadvantage to impact the route of the road? And then to your second point, we don't know all of the variables, and we'll never, at least in my mind, we'll never be able to know exactly what the Roman road was built to be in line with, and we'll never be able to kind of have a perfect understanding of what they chose. But by taking this kind of so that 500 meters as a kind of it's pretty close. It's close enough based on kind of in line with the data we have and the issues with kind of the data we have, the variables we have, and so on. And it's just trying to get a model that is relatively simple but allows us to understand the Roman roads.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. From Lewis White again, he's just wondering how much we know about the openness of the British landscape at the time of the Romans, and he's questioning whether as sighting currently through the Weald of Sussex and Kent is very difficult because of the trees in the way currently. He's wondering if the surveyors used fire or smoke beacons to get for bearings from place to place.
Yeah, so I know that has been suggested, and I can't remember who, but I know it has been suggested that they potentially did use fire beacons. I think the general consensus is probably not, and I think potentially I know at least for the gas grid, so up in Scotland they've done a bit of work about whether there were fire beacons between the watchtowers. In kind of reference to the openness of the trees, from my understanding, they would have cleared the area around the road, but I'm happy to be corrected on this. From my understanding, there was some tree clearance, but it wouldn't have been as all encompassing as we probably imagine. So there would be some sighting issues, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a subject in its own right, really. Yes.
Yeah.
From Ian and Stella Fagg, do you include gradients at right angles to the road route, i.e. terraces or landslips?
Include road gradients at right angles. So when I'm calculating the gradients, I calculate it in all directions. So, and it's not shown here because it's quite hard to actually visualize. But what I do, for example, is do the difference between gradients from this cell, for example, to the northern cell, to the eastern cell, to the southern cell, to the western cell, and then the least cost path analysis, so the method will then decide should the path go north or whatever, and then it moves on to the next one and does the same process. So it takes into account all of the directions within the model that you include. Hopefully that answered your question.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I mean, if anybody wants to follow up after the presentation, that's fine. Of course, I'm sure Joe will be interested to hear anything that way.
Really, thank you.
And I think this may be our final question. I haven't got any more in my list at the moment. From John Wood, and he's saying that he said previously that the arterial military roads are consolidated logistical supply lines. They follow the general paths of legions or exhalation cohorts of legions. So there's a wider sort of strategical direction that they may be taking.
Yeah. So it's always difficult. I think Roman roads, as I think everyone knows here, that they're extremely complicated because they rely on not only what came before, so whether they're trackways or any other features and kind of settlements and so on, but then also the fact that in Roman roads they were built for a particular reason. And in the case of the kind of military roads, as you said, I would say they, at least from a model's perspective, we would probably see that they're more varied in their gradients, and that's because it's much easier, or at least within reason, but it's much easier to kind of traverse any largely any gradient when you're on foot, as well as the fact that in some of the steeper areas, you'll either have your kind of your so if your supply trains and so on, you will have your kind of the kind of legionnaires and so on with you, who will be able to have the fun job of pushing up a hill. But there definitely is there is variety within it as well.
Thanks, Joe. And following up from John Wood again, he said that in his opinion, it's very difficult to provide archaeological evidence of fire beacons, but he thinks it's rather likely rather than not. And I think I tend to agree with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I haven't got any more questions. At the point now where I'm about to thank Joe. I don't know whether there's anything else coming through. No more questions. I'm getting the message. So it just remains for me, Joe, to thank you very much on behalf of the association for a very interesting evening.
Hello, Dave. Can you hear me?
Just a minute, Bev. Just a minute.
Thank you.
I'm sure we wish you all well in your studies, and would be very interested to hear how this develops.
Thank you.
And we've got outlets if you want to use them to demonstrate that.
No, thank you. No, I did say at the beginning, but I do want to reiterate. Thank you for allowing me to talk about my research, but then also just in general. Your website is incredible in the sense that you're doing a lot of the hard work, which thankfully means I don't have to. But it's really appreciated, and I think everyone here would probably echo the same. But then I would also say, and sorry, if you do want to reach out, there's my Twitter or email if you want to ask me any questions or anything like that. I do really appreciate it, and it's fun to talk about it.
And just like Monty Python never suspected the Spanish Inquisition, we've got Bev's questions now. It's right at the end. So over to you, Bev. You're on mute, Bev.
Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Go ahead, can hear me because a sign came up. Yes. With regard to these hills, I suspect, I'm not sure if any work's been done. If anybody knows of it, I should be very interested to hear as to the possibility of gradients, how steep they can be. As Lewis White was saying, you could have more than one horse. I've got loads of pictures of carvings. Most of them have more than one horse, and several of them have 3 or even 4 horses. And there are modern historical examples of very heavy loads being taken. Well, there's one with 40 mules would take a load of borax across the Wild West in the 19th century. It was worth doing. That was the factor. It was worth doing. So they did. So that I'm sure that could be so in the Roman period. Take, for example, I could go on, I'll stop here. Take, for example, the road from Cirencester to Gloucester up Birdlip Hill, which was used, in fact, by stagecoaches in the 18th century and was quite dangerous, but was usable. The Roman road carries along more or less the same as the turnpike route. You know, and some of those stretches in that Birdlip Hill are really quite steep, as Hugh Davis tells us. So there we are. That's that. Of all the other things, I'll just say one thing, if I may, and that is, if somebody wants to know what the countryside was like in Roman times, I would suggest they try something like Oliver Rackham, The History of the English Countryside. And I've no doubt there are other things as well. these days. Pollen analysis and all sorts of things will nowadays able to tell us all sorts of information about different historic periods.
Yeah, and yeah, no, thank you for that, Bev. And that's all. It was, yeah, good to keep in mind that they would, yeah, have and I was trying to find the French man that does a lot of work on this, Repsiet, I think his name is, something like that. But no, it's definitely something to keep in mind. And I think potentially one of the issues with trying, at least in my mind anyway, to try to take the maximum gradients and then kind of directly transpose them to say this is economic, this is military, and so on. But because there's a lot of things that can be done to overcome the difficulties, as you mentioned.
Okay, thanks, Bev.
Thank you.
Thanks very much again, Joe. Thanks very much for your contribution to what we're doing, and it's great to see a younger face involved in this as well. It's not just us old folk doing it. But I also must thank everybody for attending and being very, very well behaved, and it's been very enjoyable. And also thank the seminar team who worked behind the scenes with manipulating the questions and making the Zoom happen. And without them, this wouldn't happen at all. So thank you very much. So thank you very much to everybody, in fact. And on that note, I shall close the call down. So thank you, everybody. Good night.